to all. In today's session, we're all going to learn about what is all about the pricing in monopoly and the land market. So let's begin with the definition of public monopoly. So public monopoly is actually, in other words, we can call a utility industry or a utility monopoly, which mainly involved to provide the essential services and goods only. So such monopolies where there is only the one company involved who are mainly engaged in providing or rendering the services or producing the goods to a different consumers at the set price decided by that particular one company. In this particular category of market competition, only the one company commonly supplies the various products like energy or water to different regions or the cities. So actually, when we talk about this category, the monopoly is allowed and it is mainly regulated by the government only, by the government versus municipalities. So whatever the rates and the prices has been controlled or has been set up by the government companies or by the private companies where they are only the controller to set the prices and accordingly they will charge to the different consumers. So that is all about the monopoly, public monopoly. The next we can come up to the merits of a public monopoly. So let's begin with the merits. So when we talk about the merit, there are three main merits of the public monopoly. So if we talk about as there is no competition, as only the one company is involved, so they have a pure authority to set up the prices and keep the prices which consistent and reliable for the various consumers. The next advantage of such monopoly is they enjoy the economies of scale. And what is the economies of scale is? It is that type of advantage where the business sometimes a situation occurs that there is a chances to increase the size of the businesses. Let's take an example. If a company would like to purchase the quantities of goods in bulk, then automatically that companies always try to set up the price and sold at a lower prices, which ultimately get an advantage to sold off that particular stock or the goods which has been purchased in the bulk, and that is actually called the economies of scale. So economies of scales are those benefits, are those actually the advantages that the company is actually when increasing the size of the business. And when it comes to the public monopoly, the monopolies that actually enjoy the economies of scale because it automatically deals with the goods and services and able to produce the mass quantities or the quantities of the goods at or in bulk, which is lower than the per unit. When we talk about the third advantage of it, it is for as it is only the one company involved and the government controller has always been a stand-alone in it. So when we talk about the in this particular merit, the monopoly always allow a company to secure the investment in innovation without any fear of competition. As there is no competition, there is no plenty of the firms involved in this market competition. So automatically there is no fear of competition when it comes to this type of monopoly. The next one is demerit of public monopoly. So let's begin with the demerits of public monopoly. When you talk about the demerits in this particular category, a company is always dominates a sector or an industry and always consider or work for its own advantage without taking care of the original you can see the products. So in when any company who always dominate any sector, it would be agriculture sector, it would be the steel sector, it would be the automobile sector, or any type of industry. It always such company can use such sectors by dominating them and consider its own advantage by creating an artificial scarcities, or by creating a shortage of the goods and services, and accordingly they will fix up the prices and just produce the low quality products. So that is also a disadvantage of the public monopoly, where the companies consider its own advantage to create such scarcities which actually not possible, and accordingly they will fix up the prices and sold them at a lower uh, quality products to ultimately consumers or the potential consumers. So that is also the one of the demerit of public monopoly. When we talk about the second demerit of the public monopoly, so when there is no close substitutes, or there is a limited substitutes in the market, that consumers has no options available in that particular market, and of course there is only the one option available, that to trust on the monopolies, to trust on them so that they can operate ethically. So this is also the demerit if there is one company involved in the market and consumers has no other option than where they go to buy the goods and services, and ultimately they have to trust on that particular monopoly, and the trust is only being based that they will operate the market ethically. So that is also the one of the demerit of public monopoly. Now we talk here, we can talk about the monopoly examples here. When we talk about the public monopoly examples, we can talk about the Indian Railways. We can talk about the Loxitica, which is a new brand in the US. When we talk about the Microsoft company, Google, Facebook, any patents of any type of the product, like Apple iPhone, or the patent rights is always had hold by the company. So these are the public monopolies where no other companies actually having such rights as these companies as own right and work under the public monopoly. Now we talk about the various types of the pricing or the categories of the pricing in public monopoly. So let's begin with that. There are three main types of pricing. The first one is marginal cost pricing, second one is average cost pricing, and the third one is markup pricing. So let's begin one by one. What is all about these types and what are the merits and demerits of such category of the pricing. So let's begin with the marginal cost pricing over here. So when we talk about the marginal cost pricing, so it is actually called it is actually called a practice which always mainly involved or engaged to set up the prices for a particular product and services which is marginally slightly higher than the variable cost of production. So when marginal cost is when there is any addition refers to an additional units to be add on to a original units of a quantity and services, whether it would be the higher, whether it would be the lower than the variable cost of production. That price, that setup price is actually called the marginal cost pricing. So marginal cost pricing is to be determined by having skills, by having a knowledge of the that how they will evaluate, that how they will catch up or how they will examine the variable cost of production and whatever the margin required is to be added by the company itself. So this is a particular procedure at how the marginal cost is to be determined, because marginal cost is to be determined is based on the variable cost of production, and whatever the changes or whatever the marginal changes, it would be higher, it would be lower than the variable cost, that to be added by the company itself, and that is actually called the marginal cost pricing, that how to be determined by the company. So when you talk about the marginal cost is also presented for a short-term price setting method. So when a company is trying to set up any prices in for a short period, that actually called the marginal cost pricing, because marginal cost pricing is actually based on the short term period, or the under this particular category the price is to be determined for a short term period only. So it occurs a very it occurs in a various circumstances or a various situation when a company, you can say, has a small numbers of unused units. So when in the company when there is a unused units, then the marginal cost pricing category would come around, and that the company will adopt such pricing, and accordingly we will set up the price when the such unused units are not being sold off by the company to the potential customer. So when we talk about the marginal cost in this, the marginal cost is also being used when a firms will not be able to set a high prices for such goods and services as well. So there are various situations when the particular price is to be set up for a short period, when you can say a company has a small number of unused units, when the firm cannot able to set up the high prices of the goods and services, then this particular type of pricing will be used by the company. And when they set up the prices, it's to be based on the marginal or slightly higher or the lower than the variable cost of production. So ultimately, the marginal cost pricing totally depends upon the variable cost of pricing, variable cost of production rather than pricing. So that is called the marginal cost pricing. Now we talk about the advantages of the marginal cost pricing. The first main advantage is increased profits when there is an additional units to be added on to an original unit of goods and services to actually maximize the profit, and that is the one of the advantage of the marginal cost pricing, because the company set up the price which is higher than the variable cost of production, which ultimately leads to the profits. The next merit is the additional entry to market. So as automatically when as it is a short-term strategies, or it is a short-term pricing strategy, when the marginal cost of pricing, which always creates a better opportunities and always open up the entries to the markets which are to be add-on for the companies or for the firms. So automatically it always a potential to backfire in that particular current scenario, to actually gain the profits or the revenues, and their products will be sold to the ultimate consumers. So there is an opportunity under this particular strategy that the you can see the more markets can be opened up with the marginal cost, and the company has need to be more sensitive when it comes to setting up a prices. So and automatically, if no proper entries or additional entries to the market, and ultimately the consumers will leave the business, or you can say if the price changes unfavorably, or which is not into a limits for the consumers. So that is the one of the advantage of the marginal cost pricing. The next one is increased sales volume. So when we talk about the next advantage of marginal cost pricing, then automatically it increase the sales of the particular goods and services. If the consumers is actually have an ability or willingness to purchase products within that particular margin which has been decided by the company, or within that particular price margin which has been determined by the company, then automatically that product will leads to you can say increase in sale or leads to profit at the later period. So automatically the marginal cost of productions, it could be, it always being possible when there is an increase in the sales volume of particular product and services, and that could be possible through by setting up the marginal pricing or by adopting such strategy where the particular price is to be set up by marginally higher than the variable cost of production. Now we talk about the disadvantages or demerits of the marginal cost pricing. So if we talk about for every concept, it always have merits and demerits, and the same strategy is always considered the same framework on this particular concept. So let's talk about the demerits of the marginal cost pricing. So of course, it is always bad for the major concern for the long-term cases. As I already explained, that marginal cost pricing or that the price which has to be determined under this particular pricing strategy is always for a short-term period, but it always bad for the long-term cases, and it becomes a disadvantage of the marginal cost pricing. As if the companies adopt this strategy for a long period, it is absolutely you can say unacceptable when it comes to set up of the prices for a long period, and ultimately the prices to be set up depending upon the demand and supply of a particular good and services. And when we talk about for a long term, the fixed cost is always involved, and marginal cost pricing doesn't involve any fixed cost. It totally depends upon the variable cost of the production, and that is the main reason that it's absolutely a major concern or a bad for the long term cases. This is also the one of the reason that the for the long term cases the you can say fixed cost is always involved when to set up a particular price, but for this particular strategy it's not possible and it's absolutely unacceptable. That is one of the disadvantage of such strategy, of such pricing. The next one is market prices. The particular under this particular disadvantage, this particular strategy always work when a particular price has to be set up, which totally depends upon the marginal. It could be higher, it could be lower. But in but market price, when we decide a market price using of these strategies, it always be that minimum cost. So that is also the one of the you can say disadvantage. Why? Because always set up a price which is marginally or slightly higher than the variable cost of production. But if we talk about the market prices, this particular disadvantage always portray or convey a concept that to set up a price at a minimum level, which is absolutely unacceptable under this particular category. Then we talk about the marginal customer. That also the one of the disadvantage of this particular strategy. The marginal cost of production, it always leads to the marginal prices and the you can see the less number of customers when it comes to respond to such prices, and it always make up or build up such a scenario, such a condition or circumstances when there is a rise in the prices, then automatically goes against the company, and ultimately it will you can say leave the consumers alone when it comes to the buying the goods and services by the particular current scenario. The next one is it always focus on cost. As I already explained that the marginal cost is totally depends upon the variable cost of the production. And ultimately it also becomes one of the disadvantage because the marginal cost pricing, it always creates such a environment where the firm has to cut down the cost to increase the profits continuously. So when any company wants to increase the profits, it has to cut off cost. Ultimately, there is only the one company, there is only the single company which always hold the market and having a whole market share. So automatically to remain into a market for a continued period, so they have to reduce or cut down the cost to increase the profits. And ultimately their major focus on the cost only. And that's why they always become you can see a disadvantage of this particular strategy or pricing. The next type of pricing in public monopoly is the average cost pricing. So when we talk about the average cost pricing, so as average cost is refers to the total cost by a number of units produced to an ultimate consumers. So such policies always closest to an average cost only, and average cost is automatically refers to the total cost by number of units produced. So this pricing or strategy is another way to maximize the sales rather than the profits. So in the under this particular category, the firm can earn the normal profits in the market, and that's the main reason there is another term we can denote on this particular concept is sales maximization. Ultimately, this policy is mainly focused on the sales maximization, how the sales is to be maximized in the particular market. And the firms will use such concept is to increase the market share, and which ultimately doesn't major focus to maximize the profit, because this is the concept which has been adopted by the company is mainly to increase the market share rather than to maximize the profit. If you increase the market share, automatically the profits will be maximized, you can say, in that particular scenario. So average cost pricing, it always occurs in the perfect competition as, and it's the most suitable strategy for the perfect competitive market where the firms can only earn the normal profits. So when we talk about in this particular pricing strategy, this strategy is also occur in the oligopoly cases if the firm is always maintain or having a specific goal to maximize the sales rather than not into engage into a losses. So when we talk about in real practice, it would be a very difficult to adopt or to set up a price which is based on the average cost. Why? Because average cost is mainly depends upon the total cost and how much the units is to be produced to the ultimate consumers. So that considering the fact on this pricing, in real practice it could be difficult to adopt, because average cost doesn't mean that it ultimately generate the profits for a long or a short period. And that's why in real practice it could be a difficult to work out a firm average cost or to adopt such pricing strategy. For example, the average total cost will include not only the variable cost or the total cost or also. As I already told, that average cost is dependent upon the total cost, and total cost includes the fixed cost and the variable cost. But ultimately, it divides by the number of units to be produced the ultimate consumers. So, and when the division is to be done and whatever the answers to be come out, that is the per unit cost of that particular product. So that's why in real practice it would be difficult for the firm to set up the price using this particular concept. So when we talk about a graphical representation, so this is a graphical representation where that how the farms will set up the average cost pricing in that particular current market scenario. So when we talk about this particular category, so there are two curves you can see on the screen that D stands for demand, which is equal to average revenue, and there is another downward sloping curve which is called the marginal revenue. Under this particular graphical representation, there are two costs that's already always been mentioned when it comes to estimate the average cost, and the average cost will be set up along with the marginal cost, because without marginal cost, average cost equilibrium determination couldn't be possible, because when these two costs will intersect the demand curve, which is equal to price or which is equal to average revenue, that particular point is actually called the equilibrium point, where the P1 is the original price level and the Q2 is the original output when it comes to the applying such strategy. So when we talk about the average cost pricing, so the average cost pricing is already been set up, that is called the P1. P1 is the average cost pricing has been set up and the quantity output is Q2. So when there is a change in the prices, then automatically the prices will the new prices will become the PM, and the QM is a new change of the quantity. Then ultimately the quantity output would get reduced due to an increase in the prices of that particular goods and services which has been made by the company. So ultimately, the monopoly price has been the monopolies have under the monopolies the price is to be determined which is marginally higher than the variable cost. And ultimately, when we talk about the average cost pricing, the prices could if the prices could be higher, the output would automatically get reduced and reduced from Q2 to QM, and the price would get increased from P1 to PM. So just because the original quantity is P1 and the original output is Q2, so automatically if there is an increase in the price level, then quantity would get reduced, and then when there is an increase in the price level, the monopoly price would be the PM and the average cost price would be the P1. As under the average cost pricing, the cost would be at the minimum level, would be the lower cost. But when we talk about the marginal cost pricing or to decide the monopoly price, it could be higher than the original price, that is would be PM, and automatically when there will be higher price, the quantity will get reduced. That means there is an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity, you can say, or the output demanded by the customers in that particular current market. So this is how the average cost is to be decided, and average cost price to be decided at the point of the equilibrium where the demand, marginal cost, and average cost will intersect each other. So if there is any increase, then automatically the output would decrease, and ultimately the increase of the price would be the monopoly price, and the equilibrium price would be the average cost pricing. So this is all about in this graphical representation. The next concept is markup pricing. This is also the one of the most important topic when it comes to the when it comes to ask about this particular concept. So markup pricing is that particular type of pricing strategy which always add something, a small amount of percentage or any fixed amount to an ultimate cost of a product or service, so that they can accordingly set up or determine the selling price, and that is called the markup price. So when the firm adds some percentage of cost or add any fixed amount to the cost of a goods or services, or products or services just mainly to set up the selling price, that actually called the markup pricing strategy. And it always covers the cost of production, the variable cost, the variable expenses, the business expenses or overheads. And ultimately, when these expenses involve or these any fixed amount related to these expenses involved to the particular cost of product and services, so that accordingly the price could be determined. That is called the markup pricing, and the amount of markup is depends upon the needs. It depends upon what type of business is involved, what would be the industry, you can say in it, where the firm could enter or where firm could enter, or markup prices accordingly would be decided upon the, you can say, adding up any percent of fixed. It totally depends on these factors only: the needs, the type of business, and what type of industry is mainly involved in it, and that is exactly called the markup pricing. This is a way that how to calculate the markup pricing. So this is the main formula of markup pricing, where you need to calculate the cost. It could be the cost of raw material, it could be the cost of labor, it could be any other direct production cost. The cost is mainly related to the production only. The next is how you set up the markup percentage. That means you have to decide any fixed amount, you have to decide any percentage, so that they will add on to the cost of a product and services, or it, so that why it's asking about the markup percentage, so that such particular fixed amount, such particular percentage, which always cover up the overhead, the, you can see, the expenses, the cost of the expenses, and ultimately leads to provide some profits to the company. And that is the ultimate conceptual framework of the markup pricing strategy. So once a particular firm calculate the cost, they will set up the markup percentage or any fixed amount. Then ultimately at the end they can easily calculate the selling price. And while calculating the selling price, there is a mathematical formula is to be adopted, which is equal to then how you calculate the markup percentage, that is equal to the sales price minus unit cost of a product by unit cost of a product into 100. So when any firm will, you can see, use this formula, they can easily calculate the selling price, which is based on the markup percentage or any fixed amount to the cost of product and services, and which ultimately leads to profit. So this is a way that how the markup pricing will be calculated. So when we talk about the markup pricing, it is a very common pricing strategies which are mainly adopted by the manufacturing or the retail businesses. So when you reach out any retail, you can see complex or the departmental stores, so the selling price is totally depends on the markup pricing strategy only. So if you visit any departmental store, or if you visit any, for example, Reliance Trends, or if you can see the price tag or the selling price, it automatically depends on this particular strategy. Why? Because that selling price will cover up the expense, you can see the cost of the expenses of that particular product and services, and it leads to the profit margin to the company. And that is a strategic tool which always helps the retail business, which always helps to the manufacturing business, which always get into a profitable margin, in which cover up all the business costs, which are mainly measured, which are mainly accounted for. So this is the way that how the markup pricing is being calculated. Now, what is the applications of in business, that how you can say these particular strategies would be used in business only based on these two factors only. The first one is pricing strategies, and the second one is evaluating the business health. So when you talk about the pricing strategy, But after understanding the market pricing concept, it always helps to set up the prices of the goods and services so that a particular profit margin, or you can say a specific profit amount on every scale is to be earned. So it always, and when it comes to the business level, the businesses or the firms will always monitor the profit margin in each particular period. It could be months, it could be quarterly, it could be half yearly, it could be yearly, so that whatever the business strategies has been adopted, it could be monitored, and any guidance to be required, and accordingly it would be work on and take up an actions on it, or take up soundful decisions when it comes to the any expense management, any scale of operation, and any of the factors or the needs, and accordingly such strategies will be applied in the businesses. The next one is evaluating the business health. These strategies will be applied after evaluating the business health of the particular, or you can say, market, or whether it would be the perfect market, it would be the monopoly, or it would be any kind of monopolistic or oligopoly. So when to apply such strategies, is always important to check on or to evaluate or examine that how much the profit margin has been earned by the company. It would be the higher, and it would be or lower, which always indicate the efficient operations, and what would be the effective management cost or cost management when there is a changes in the markup prices which has been set up, and how much the changes in how much the changes in markup just due to the fluctuations in the production cost, or any type of the pricing strategies, that is actually will be examined by the pricing strategies only, that how the well pricing strategies is to be adopted by the firms to evaluate the business health. Now, how to use the markup pricing? Just set the prices of different products lines. It cover up. It totally depends upon the market demands, competitive scenarios. If we talk about the luxury items, then automatically the higher markup prices to be set off, so that every customer, you can see, able to look up the luxury items, and if they can capable to pay up the price, the markup price, they can easily go for that. Otherwise, for the everyday items also, for the everyday items, a lower markup price will be adopted, which ultimately leads to the higher volume. So this is how the markup prices to be set up depending upon the different product lines. The next one is simple calculation. When we talk about the complexity of the environment, when we talk about the complexity in the finance world, then ultimately the simplicity of such pricing is actually give to the company a fresh air, because it is a formulative approach where the businesses, whether it would be large or small, can easily determine the selling prices of a particular product and service, which ultimately is for the you can see the companies, without going into a deep to examine any financial analysis of it. So this is also the simple calculation is always used to estimate the markup pricing in terms of different products and services. Now we talk about establish that market pricing, establish a competitive pricing strategy. So it could be any business area or any kind of industry area. The setting the prices actually is not enough. We have to look up the other factors as well to understand the competitors, to understand the scenario of the rivals, to understand the market trends, how they utilize the market prices so that the businesses could be set alone or maintain a balance while setting up the prices which and we have to keep a look whether such prices would be attractive to the customer or it still ensure any profits volume or not. So that is this is a way that how the companies could establish a competitive pricing strategy by looking up these particular factors in that particular market. The next one is meet profit goals. And ultimately, market prices always leads to a profits when there is an increase in the sales volume. So it could be possible when any markup percentage is to be adjusted and accordingly the business can earn revenues or you can see the profits along with analyzing the financial health or the business health and how they will attain the objectives of the company. So this is how the market prices would help to meet up the profit goals. Next one is deliver what customer wants. So market prices always deliver what the customer wants from the you can see by setting up the prices. So it totally a particular research and development is to be done. Like we have to check on the customer demand. We have to do a market research and the feedback analysis, and accordingly the company could set up the market percentage which not only ensures the profit but also ensures that particular pricing parameters that actually customers are willing to pay and that actually the customer are willing to afford the prices or not. So that is actually totally depends upon the markup pricing strategy and how they will grab into it. The next one is adjust prices over time. So when we talk about adjust prices over time, the only constant or the consistency factor in businesses change. There is always a change in the market. There always a change in the customers' minds. So automatically the cost of material would also get changed. It could be rise, it could be low, and new competitors could enter. Our global events could also reshape the market dynamics. So automatically through the market pricing, businesses will always have a flexibility to revisit, to rethink, and accordingly they will adjust the pricing structure so that they can give three main things. It remains relevant, the business can become competitive, and of course profitable. So this is how the market pricing would help to adjust the prices over a period of time. Now we talk about the land market where the rent is a major or you can say factor when any farm or any landowner or any tenant would like to use the land for any particular purposes. So let's begin with that. Automatically when we talk about any price, obviously when land we can talk land is a fixed factor and the prices of such factors is generally known as the rent or a pure economic rent. So whatever the price is to be paid by the tenant is to be paid by the land owner is actually called the pure economic rent or rent, and economics always apply the term rent not only to the land which is a fixed factor of production, it always apply to a particular supply which always been into a factor. So when we talk about the supply curve of a land is completely inelastic, is completely vertical, as the supply of the land is remains fixed. But when we talk about the demand curve of the land or for the land is actually a downward sloping. So when there is an interaction, or you can say when there is an interaction between the demand and supply curve in regard to land, that particular point of interaction is actually called the equilibrium point, and that point of equilibrium is actually gives the rent of land. So this is how the rent will become as return when there is a use of any land for any of the purposes. So land is also a factor of production, which includes the free gifts of the nature to the mankind. So if anyone having a land and they wants to give a gift, anyone wants to gift a land to their family members, so automatically it called a free gifts when it comes to give a land as a gifts to someone. It always includes beside the surface all the minerals, forest, water, stream. Everything is totally depends on land only because the land is a fixed factor of production where all such resources could easily generate by the firms or companies. Let's talk about the demand in the land market. So this is all basic parameters. When we talk about the demand in the land market, so when the land is rented, so automatically the factor price of land is actually called the rental rate. So when the land is rented, the rate of that particular rent is called the rental rate, which is denoted by R. When we talk about the quantity of land, the units of land, how much the acres of land, it could be denoted by Q. So there are the three major concepts, that is the demand in the land market. It always refers the willingness of the firm, the ability of the firm, that how much they can able to purchase, how able to pay for purchase, and how they will rent a land at a given time. That is actually called the demand in the land market. The rental rate of land is actually a price when at which the land is sold or rented at a given particular time. The quantity of the land demanded is actually the quantity of the land firms which are willing to purchase or rent at a particular price at the given time. So when it comes to the demand, it's willingness or the ability of the firms. But when we talk about the quantity of the land demanded, is actually their willingness to purchase or rent at a particular price or a given price at a given time. So this is the whole conceptual framework of demand in a land market. Now we talk about you can see the supply in the market for land. So when we talk about the supply, we can, in other words, we talk about the land supply or the quantity land supplied in the rental rate. So the rental rate of the land is actually the price where the land is sold or rented at a given time. So let's focus the definitions of the land supply and the quantity of land supply. So when we talk about the land supply, it's the availability of the land, and whether the land is available for the purchase or the rental by the firms at a given time period. The quantity of land supply is the quantity of the land at which is made available for the firms to purchase or rent at a given price at a given time. So that is the whole two main concept under the supply in the land market. So this is a diagram of the supply and the land market. So when we talk about, as the supply always remains the fixed for the land, which always remains in a red line vertical shape. But when we talk about the demand for the land, is always be a downward sloping. So as the P1, when we talk about on the supply one, the quantity of the land is always equal. So automatically, if there is a changes in the prices, Like we talk about the increase in the prices, but ultimately the quantity will remain unchanged. Even the landlord owners would like to pay the high prices from P1 to P2, where the demand will ultimately shift. The right word would be the parallel shift. Then also the quantity of the land will remain unchanged. It cannot be changed at all, as the under this particular framework the supply curve is always vertical and the demand curve is downward sloping. So there would be a shift, a rightward shift of the demand curve, but the quantity will remain the same. As per the conceptual framework, or to conclude this particular diagrammatic presentation, when there is a change in the prices, the supply will remain fixed, but the demand curve will always be a downward sloping, but it would be the parallel shifts of a demand curve from D1 to D2. So this is how this scenario would work. When there is an increase in the prices, demand will definitely change, but the quantity of that land will remain unchanged. So this is the concept of the equilibrium when it comes to decide that P1 where the demand curve and the supply intersect each other. That is P1 when there is an increase, then automatically the demand curve will shift to the rightward, as the quantity of that particular land supply is always being fixed. Now we talk about the fixed supply in the land market. So when we talk about the fixed supply in the land market, the concept of economic rent has always been important to understand. So any factor of production who earns, like for example, land earns rent. That rent is called the economic rent when the payment for that factor exceeds the needed payment to use it. So economic rent refers when any payment of that factors is higher than the payment needed to use that land is actually called the economic rent. So economic rent is earned when the payment for a factor of production exceeds the needed payment to use it. So when, like for example, if we talk about the land, I need a payment of 1 lakh rupees to use that land, but the payment I receive is actually higher than the payment needed to use it. That difference is actually called the economic rent. So when we talk about the fixed supply, so in this particular scenario, land remains available in supply. Whatever the changes in its prices or any payment received for such land is actually called the economic rent. So these are the examples. If you look up on the screen. So these are the examples of the land market. So the land is always a natural resource. So the examples of such land market would be a different natural resources. So these are the five examples of land market: the market for timber, the market for copper, the market for aluminium, the market for water, the market for limestone. So these are the examples of the land market which you can able to write up in your answer scripts. Let's talk about that. What would be the effect of tax burden on land? So this is the scenario, a graphical representation over here. So as I told, the supply curve of a land, it always remains fixed and always on a vertical shape, as the demand curve, which is the original demand curve, is D1, D1. And the change, when there is a change in the tax on land, the demand curve would shift to the leftward, and a new demand curve would be the D2, D2. So Automatically, when we talk about the when there is an interaction between the demand and supply, that point is called the equilibrium point of land, and whatever the payment received on that land is actually called the economic rent. So when there is an interaction of D1, D1 and SS, that interaction point is called E1, and automatically you can see when there is a, you can see change in the taxes or there is an increase in the taxes on land, then ultimately the quantity of the land will remains fixed, but ultimately the demand would shifts leftward and a new equilibrium will arrive when a new demand curve, that is D2 D2, intersect the supply curve, and when a new interaction point of the D2 D2 and S is, that point is actually called the E2, a new equilibrium point where the quantity of land and ultimately the economic range would get reduced from E2 and E1 to E2. So automatically when the supply will remains constant. So when there is a changes in the taxes, it would be the higher taxes, the demand curve would shift leftward, and where there's a higher taxes, the demand curve would shift the rightwards or the parallel shift to the right. So automatically, totally depends on how the when there is a tax has to be imposed on the land, and ultimately the demand automatically influence when there is a no change in any quantity of land. So automatically, what would be the differences between the equilibrium points? That difference automatically portray the differences of the rent received as payment for that factor of production, namely a land. So this is how the burden of the tax is always affect on land. But when we talk about the effect of tax on land automatically influence the demand on land, but the quantity of that land will remains and the supply of that land, or in other words the quantity of that land is actually remains constant, it remains unchanged or unaffected. So automatically, if there is a changes in taxes, the demand would get influenced on the land. It could be increased, it could be decreased, and depending upon the rent will ultimately would fluctuates when there is a change in the tax rate on that particular land. There is a one theory of the land which is rent, which is called the Marshall theory of rent, is based on these four or three ideas: the transfer earnings, the quasi rent, and rent. So when we talk about the transfer earnings, it is a minimum amount of earnings which are really needed to keep a factor of production, say a land in its current use. So whatever the amount of earnings, but it would be minimum required to keep the particular factor is in current use, that is called the transfer earnings. Quasi rent, it is an additional income earned over and over the transfer earnings, which is very similar to the rent or economic rent, but on a temporary in nature. So the quasi rent is not permanent after all, it is depends upon the transfer earnings. So whatever the additional income earned on transfer earnings, that is called the quasi rent. And rent is a difference between the actual earnings and the transfer earnings from land, and that is called rent. So Marshall theory of rent is always adopted to approaches, that is extensive cultivation where the plenty of the technology is being used, and the incentive cultivation where the laborers will use to cultivate the crops. But the Marshall is always criticized these assumptions as well, because it always applied into a perfect competition. And of course, the power of land is always to be original and indestructible. So that is the concept of the Alfred Marshall theory of rent, that whatever the rent to be received, it to be received when such particular factor of production is in current use. And accordingly, the quasi rent and rent would be, the concept would be, and its concept and its meaning would be adopt. And this rent is always followed two approaches, and accordingly, he also such concepts having the assumption, and that assumption has also been criticized in case of perfect competition, such as original or indestructible power of land. So this is actually the Alfred Marshall is actually portraying his theory of rent, which is totally based on the idea of three main elements: the transfer earnings, quasi rent, and rent. Later, there are various economics such as J.S. Mill, John Robinson, which always build upon the Marshall theory. You can say they always focus on the Marshall theory to introduce. There is a need to introduce the demand and supply framework, as in modern economies or a modern analysis economic analysis, the rent is actually determined by the interaction of demand and supply curves. So the Marshall theory is actually not based on the modern perspective. So the later there are various economists whose named as J.L. Mill or John Robinson has introduced the concept of demand and supply framework, and according to them, it always denoted that rent is always being set up or determined when there is an interaction of the demand and supply curve. So this is all about today. So I'll come up into a next sessions for a more interesting and the relevant topics. Till time, thanks for listening my lecture, and namaste to all.